lot of stuff planned this afternoon. It's not our normal schedule. One of the great announcements that we've had recently is Linaro has, I think as everybody knows, has become a member of the Linux Foundation, and actually this past week, the Linux Foundation has become a member of Linaro, so I think it's a terrific thing. And today we have, did I miss that? Today we have Jim Zemlin, the Executive Director of the Linux Foundation, who joined us last year when we were at Santa Clara and spoke to us, is also going to speak to us again today. I'm sure his topic will be very interesting and quite applicable for everyone in this room. After his keynote, we will have a demo lunch in the Grand Peninsula EF&G rooms, and that will go for an hour, and then we'll start sort of our wrap-up summaries, which will start with the steering committee wrap-ups, and then be followed by the various working groups, member services, and other groups wrap-ups. And then at 4 o'clock, we'll be pretty much done. So sort of a short afternoon, and I'm going to please join me in welcoming Jim Zemlin.
Thanks for having me. Wow, this is a packed room. I thought there'd be like 3 people here on the last day of an event like this, but I'm really glad to see all of you here. As one of your newest members, I'm going to I decided just right now that I'm not going to give this talk. I'm just going to spend about 30 minutes complaining about how I'm not getting full member value. Did somebody just clap for that? I think no, we are very happy to be a member of Linaro working with you. The work that's going on in Linaro is terrific. George asked me to come today and talk about the Linux Foundation's perspective of what we're seeing from the ARM ecosystem and from Linaro, and then talk a little bit about what all of you are doing and how that fits into the broader technology landscape. You know, sort of every day you hear about some new open source collaboration, a new foundation, a new consortium of people getting together to collaborate. And you know, the question is, when are people going to get sick of all these? Right? When are people going to say, hey, they're saying, why do we have 3,000 foundations all doing this kind of stuff? Is there some point where, you know, enough is enough? And I thought I would spend some time discussing that with all of you today. But I think yesterday I had Greg Crow-Hartman pull the latest stats on what Linaro is doing in the Linux kernel, and suffice to say, all you folks are having a big impact on Linux. In the latest 3.11 to 3.16 kernel releases, you guys are number 5 in the rankings. So that is a huge, huge impact that all of you are having in the kernel. Greg asked me to, and I don't know if these were his exact words, but to relay that the code quality is also very, very good, that the work that everyone is doing is great. I myself cannot judge that, so I have to rely on Greg for that. But congratulations, really, to all of you on the terrific work that Linaro continues to do on behalf of all of your members and on behalf of your ecosystem. It just makes Linux stronger, and as Linux grows, we're going to see it in more interesting form factors, more interesting areas than we ever have before. And certainly the silicon that all of you are supporting is driving really much that growth and really some of the more interesting aspects of wearables, the Internet of Things, all of that. So good job. So the question that I thought I'd spend most of my time talking about today, other than congratulating all of you on your work, is, you know, what is the role of Linaro and organizations like Linaro in the technology industry today? You know, the question you get maybe when people are considering joining Linaro, or when people are asking George what he does, is, you know, why do these kind of organizations exist? What is it today that's creating so many of these collaborative bodies? And, you know, the reality is that the landscape of mass collaboration is really changing. What in the traditional open source sense was really kind of an anti-movement in the past. Mad Dog is right here. John Mad Dog Hall is in the front row, and I think he was one of the godfathers of this, both literally and figuratively, of this movement where open source was about, you know, kind of taking all that corporate stuff and all that marketing stuff and sort of saying, hey, we're going to do it the right way. We're going to do it our way. We're going to do it based on technical excellence and coding merit, and we're going to go create these open and free systems that we can all collaborate on and, forget about the man. And what is great about that, and what has proven to make a real change in mass collaboration, is that Mad Dog and so many of the people who've been in open source for quite some time, it turns out that they are on the right side of history. And being on the right side of history is certainly important in life. And what we've seen as a result is a huge explosion of not sort of volunteer, small-scale, hacker-led efforts, but large-scale professionalization of mass collaboration in the software industry and the technology sector on a scale that is really unprecedented. We see foundation upon foundation, open source project upon open source project, consortium upon consortium, where people are no longer inventing software in isolation, but really collaborating in an organized, systematic way, really on a scale that we've really never seen. And this is just, I sort of randomly picked a small list of projects, but I think you'll recognize most of these, and there's certainly a much longer list. I think one of the things, if we step back and look at, not only has open source been on the right side of history, but there's another historic trend that is driving this kind of software collaboration above all else. And I think Marc Andreessen said this well in a very famous op-ed piece that he wrote for the Wall Street Journal back in 2011 entitled "Software is Eating the World." Today software really is driving more and more of the value in almost every single segment of technology. The ARM ecosystem is most certainly at the forefront of this, as more consumer electronic devices, as your consumer appliances, automobiles, watches, all of this change towards really from a hardware-centric perspective to a software-centric perspective in terms of the value that people derive from those. People now expect their automobiles to be smart, to be able to do navigation, to be able to really have a large-scale computer network inside of them, to do things like autonomous driving control, all of these things. Wearable devices we're only at the beginning of the sophistication that we will see not just fitness trackers, but things that can really impact healthcare. All of those things are driven by a combination of hardware, sensors, and silicon, but the real vast majority of the value that someone experiences from those different technologies is driven from software. I used to do this slide where I would show 5, 6 smartphones all turned off, right? And it's not really, and they all look basically the same, right? It's just kind of a big screen, right? If you look at your smartphone even right now and compare it to your neighbors with the screen off, even if you have different models, they really are the same. It's only when you turn them on that you see the software, interact with that software, that you understand where the value from those devices are happening. In fact, I've had CEOs of large companies talk to me about this very trend in the network equipment space, in the hardware space, and say, Jim, one of my big challenges as a business is that I sell hardware equipment. I sell PCs, let's say, or enterprise servers or networking equipment. All of that is being abstracted and commoditized by software. Right? As we see server virtualization, now we see network virtualization, storage virtualization. Hardware value is now being abstracted into software, and that really is changing the world. And when one particular CEO said this to me, he said, I'm really concerned about our long-term vision here because of this commoditization of our hardware by software. I said, well, you're only half right. Your business is being commoditized by software as it is abstracted increasingly into virtualized software appliances. The problem is software is also being commoditized by open source software. Open source software is really eating the software world, right? Increasingly, when you look at different technology services, technology appliances, technology products, if you just look at the sheer lines of code in any of those products or services, the percentage of code in those things that is open source keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger on a percentage basis, right? Nobody really can. In fact, I was just in Korea this week, and talking to executives at Samsung who just said, listen, we can't build anything without open source software. It's just the new reality that we find ourselves in as a company. If we want to stay agile, we are going to get better and better at consuming, implementing, and selling products based on open source software. And when I think about this, what's really happening as the percentage of code inside any kind of technology product or service is the percentage of code becomes increasingly open source. What we're really entering into is this concept of a Pareto Principle, right? This is the 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the value, or 80% of the value comes from 20% of that particular code base, right? And I think that's an interesting concept to apply, and Gartner Group, I think, illustrates this well when thinking about what is really happening in the tech sector relative to open source. What most firms that we are working with, and this is not just because the Linux Foundation deals with people who are interested in open source. I think that may have been true 4 or 5 years ago, but this is really with almost every technology sector and firm in the world. They're all striving to reach a more strategic use of open source. Instead of using 30-40% of their code from an open source collaborative perspective, they're looking at using really more like 80% of their code as open source. And when you ask any of these folks for the reason for that, it's because what they have told me, almost all of them, is because I just want to focus on the stuff that makes our organization, our company, our service unique. Why on earth, with more and more complexity in software itself, would I want to go by myself and create all of the underlying plumbing, even up to fairly high layers of the software stack? Why would I want to go recreate that all by myself? I'd be crazy to do it. And so what we're going to focus on, and what most companies are focusing on, is what they tell me is, hey, that 20% where we really are unique and different. And in some cases, it's even more extreme than that. In the case of Twitter, as an example, they release almost all of the source code that runs Twitter, right? Because they're not even in the software business. They're really in the people and data business. And so proprietary software really poses no advantage to Twitter, right? Twitter benefits from a network effect. The fact that everyone uses Twitter makes it so that people will continue to use Twitter, right? Facebook is the same. That's why you see companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon and Twitter releasing tremendous amounts of high-quality software and sharing it amongst themselves to enable massive scale-out infrastructure really on an ongoing scale. One of the greatest illustrations I love of this, this trend comes from a book written by Michael Lewis, who is a author on all matters Wall Street related. Has anybody read the book Flash Boys by Michael Lewis? Does anybody here work on high-frequency trading platforms? Anyone? All right. Maybe it's a little lower in the stack that you guys are focused. High-frequency trading, proprietary trading in Wall Street is generating billions and billions of dollars of revenue. I actually know of a particular, I'm not going to mention who it is, I know of a couple of kernel developers and some project maintainers of some critical open source projects that have been hired by Wall Street banks for 7-figure salaries. There's a tremendous competition in Wall Street for technology, because in the finance industry, technology is becoming this incredible competitive advantage, this differentiator that, when paired with high-frequency trading and proprietary trading systems, is generating billions of dollars of revenue for those companies. Now, some of you may have an opinion about high-frequency trading and front-running trades that it's not the greatest thing in the world, but regardless, this is a competitive technology landscape where billions of dollars are at stake. But the punchline is the quote from this book. Michael Lewis wrote and interviewed lots and lots of the technologists who work in these high-end financial services platforms. And in interviewing one of the folks who works inside of one of these very secretive high-performance trading platforms, he found someone who sort of fessed up in terms of what's really going on within these companies. That you know, they'd all like to purport, every bank in the world would like to purport that their trading platform somehow is built on some brilliant secret sauce. But when they find out that 95% of that open source, that code is open source, it sort of kills that percentage. So 95% of their code, they're only focusing on that 5%, you know, those secret algorithms that, you know, truly add value to that platform. And so as you can see, people are moving to a broader adoption of open source. Software is becoming very centric to where value is being created. And this is where consortium and foundations, organizations like Linaro, organizations like the Linux Foundation, the Cloud Foundry Foundation, all the ones I listed earlier, that's where they really come into play. What you are seeing is a institutionalization, I would argue for the better, a professionalization of what John Mad Dog Hall and the hacker community knew the whole time, which is this is just a better way to produce software. Sharing is better. Open source code works. This development model is better. And what organizations like Linaro and our organizations and many others are offering is a common set of components that enable this sort of large-scale collaboration. When you enter an organization like Linaro or any others, there's a structure for sharing intellectual property that allows you to come in and share what you want to share and keep what you want to keep. There's a way to underwrite it through a membership and a set of bylaws that allow you to incorporate and pool money together. There's a shared development methodology that is becoming increasingly important. Really, everybody's moving over to social coding styles. GitHub is testimony to how important this movement is in the broader technology industry, something that's perhaps second nature to all of you. The infrastructure that is required for this form of mass collaboration is important. You know, things like the testing frameworks and all the things that you guys are working on here at Linaro matter, because you need a scalable, shared way to do things like testing and development across a wide variety of companies and individuals who have perhaps at some point different interests or in fact even competitive interests. To have a neutral playing ground, to have a place where you can collectively develop an ecosystem, create educational tools and materials to build and bring more developers into your ecosystem. Having, you know, a firm way to manage the way intellectual property gets shared so that you know where code came from, that the people who contributed had the rights to share that code, that you can defend that from a legal perspective. These are all the ingredients that organizations like Linaro and other projects similar to it, other foundations who do this form of mass collaboration, bring to the table. I would say Linaro brings an even more advanced component to this in that, you know, you really deliver a ton of code and value to all your members, right? That they probably would not do as efficiently if they had to create all this stuff on their own, right? That's the whole reason that you got into it. And you all know that because you're all working on this, but the broader context is the way that the tech sector is looking at interoperability, at IP sharing, at code sharing is really changed. Open source is really now usurping what were traditionally roles led by standard setting organizations. Standard SDOs is the term for standards development organizations. Increasingly we see new open source projects filling the role for what might have been done previously in standard setting. In the Internet of Things space, a great example of that is a project that we host at the Linux Foundation called AllSeen. Has anybody ever heard of the AllSeen project? Okay, so quite a few of you. So this is essentially a framework that allows devices across different manufacturers and different types of products to share their capabilities, interoperate with each other. You need a standard way to share that information across these different manufacturers and different products. And there have been a ton of attempts to do that. DLNA is a good example of that, other spec development work to do that. And what we're seeing now in IoT is that people are saying, hey, listen, I'm not going to hand a light bulb manufacturer a 500-page specification and tell them to have at it or go license some software somewhere else. I'm just going to give them the code. And it will interoperate more effectively because everybody's sharing that same code. I think this is really the future of how, this is a permanent fixture in how the technology industry is going to operate. So by participating in something like Linaro, I think you're really in the middle of what really is going to be the future norm at great scale within IT. And the Linux Foundation is seeing a lot of this as well. I wanted to just give you guys some examples of what we're seeing at the foundation. You know, the work that you guys are doing really is building an ecosystem that is incredible. And over at our end of the Linux world, we're seeing this repeated over and over and over again, where more and more people want to come together to solve big problems. You know, one example of a recent movement to try and do a better job of sharing resources is the Core Infrastructure Initiative. How many people here have heard of the Core Infrastructure Initiative? A few of you. How many people here heard about Heartbleed, the Heartbleed bug? A lot more. How many people who here were directly affected by Heartbleed and had to remediate it? Yeah, I knew there would be some people in here. A real pain in the rear, right? You know, I mean, you have to go figure out where, the estimates are that it costs about $500 million globally to remediate Heartbleed. And so the core infrastructure is an interesting sharing development. So when Heartbleed happened, the world sort of woke up and said, how did we all end up sharing the OpenSSL code that caused Heartbleed, or what was the source of Heartbleed, and there's only like a couple of guys named Steve that are working on it, right? You think I'm joking? It's Steve Henson and Steve Marquez. I've talked to these guys, and this was a project that was really under-resourced. This was a market failure in sharing, right? This is, I think, a perfect illustration of why sharing and this kind of collaborative development is so important, because we're already there, right? You know, so much of the internet security and stability depends on the OpenSSL, and no one was really helping out with OpenSSL. It was a very small team working tirelessly, frankly, for almost no pay. So what we decided with the Core Infrastructure Initiative is we would get together with Amazon, Facebook, Google, Cisco, Dell, I mean, HP, Huawei, all these companies that are leaders in the technology space, and go try and help these guys out. And not just do it for the OpenSSL group, which we provided fellowships for, similar to what we do for Linus, but to solve this problem for all open source projects that are important to the stability and security of the internet, and need resources and help to get to where many of these other projects I talked about are, to a really systematic, scalable way to share. And so we raised about $6 million. We've already provided grants to the OpenSSL project in the form of fellowships, the Network Time Protocol, NTP project, OpenSSH, and a variety of others. And we will continue to write grants to any open source project that fits the criteria of being very important to the global economy and the stability and integrity of the internet, and are woefully under-resourced due to whatever market failure may result. So that's a great example of where, again, you're starting to scale and put real resources, and people see that you need to have skin in the game and teeth behind these large collaborative projects. And we've got a whole bunch more. I'm not going to go through each of them, but in IoT, automotive, software-defined networking, virtualization, financial services software, mobile software, embedded systems, you name it. I think all of you have heard of some of these. In this group, I think the Yocto project and projects like that are probably most applicable. But this is really what we're seeing, and we will be announcing in the next couple of weeks even more of these large-scale collaborative projects that we're working with at the foundation. And it's not just going to be the Linux Foundation. I think you'll see lots more of these happening outside of our organization, just all over the world. Because what Linaro is doing and what these kind of organizations are doing are a permanent fixture of the technology industry. People aren't going to build stuff on their own anymore. Your job security is pretty much guaranteed. So in closing, what I'd like to ask is, we're all working in open source, and there's all variety of open source projects. But the question when you're working on these, and this is the question I get all the time, what makes for a truly great open source effort? What are the metrics one should measure oneself against for a truly unbelievable open source project? It could look like this. The kernel's now changing 9 times an hour, according to Greg. I think Linaro is probably responsible for quite a bit of that ongoing change, which is outstanding. It's a multi-billion-dollar shared R&D investment. There are millions of people who utilize this code. It dominates in mobile devices, high-performance computing, embedded systems, enterprise servers. It is the de facto platform for the global economy. And while I think these numbers are important and these metrics are important to judge an open source blockbuster, I don't think that is enough. And I want to share a short video with you that I think best exemplifies what an open source blockbuster should really look like.
We had a family PC since about 2010, and in 2012 I heard of Linux, and I started experimenting with it a lot. I think my first distro was Ubuntu 12.04 that I tried out in VirtualBox. I don't know too much programming. I don't even know much programming, but I would still love to learn programming and even get a job. Maybe someday I could probably become a sysadmin in Linux. I could help people use Linux. It was a school project. Of course, I decided to send a letter to Linus Torvalds. He was my hero, and I was actually doubting I would actually be able to find out, who I could send it to. Then I remembered how much I love Linux, and how much I wanted to meet Linus Torvalds. So I decided to send him a letter. All my other friends sent letters to, more Hollywood or internet celebrities, but I doubt they actually got flown to, a good place like this to meet them. Meeting Linus Torvalds was a great experience. Once the whole panel thing was done, he went out of the stage, went to my row, and we shook hands, and he signed my Linux Bible, and he gave me a copy of his Just for Fun book with a signature, of course. I loved meeting Linus Torvalds, and it was a great experience overall. I got to have so much goodies or swag, and it made me think, all these things like my future is going to be great, and I loved it.
I saw Zach that night after he met Linus at a party we hosted at the Science Museum in Chicago. He turned to me and said he was having the best day of his life. That is a successful open source project. That, when you're having a bad day or something's going wrong at work, remember that you are not just bettering yourself, but you're bettering your company, Linaro, or the members of Linaro, and you are bettering the world. That is what an open source blockbuster looks like. Fortuitously, that is what the future of technology looks like. And I want to thank all of you for participating in that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jim. Very interesting as always. And Jim has also given us another gift on this Friday. He's given us 25 minutes of our life back. So we can move over to the Grand Peninsula Ballroom and check out the demos and have some lunch. We'll see you back here at 2 o'clock.